Welcome and thank you for joining us. Today we are going to address the great questions and comments we received during Monrovia's Future of Gardening, Living Beauty Everyday webinar. My name is Kathleen Hennessy and I'm here today with Katie Tamony, Trend Spotter and Chief Marketing Officer at Monrovia, and Georgia Clay, Monrovia's New Plants Manager and go-to gardening expert. Before we jump into our discussion, I want to remind everyone that you can participate in future webinars and ask your questions live by subscribing to Monrovia's Grow Beautifully newsletter at monrovia.com. By joining, you'll be the first to get information on those new webinars. Hello, Katie. Hello, Georgia.
Hello. Great to be here.
Let's get right to the first question. Our viewers wanted to know, how do you find new plants?
Well, Georgia, I know that we find new plants in several ways and that we're always looking out for plants that have improvements like longer blooming and disease resistance. But why don't you actually give more of the detail about how we find new plants? Because I think one thing that's interesting to me is that sometimes we find new plants kind of right under our nose at the nursery.
Yeah, totally. So like you mentioned, we have many ways of finding new plants, but I agree. One of the most exciting ways is actually finding them on our nursery. So we have had quite a lot of introductions come to us because our craftsmen have eagle eyes and they notice things growing amidst our normal crops that are special or unique. And so Burgundy Queen Bougainvillea is a great example of this. This was actually found by one of our growers at our Cairo nursery in Georgia. He noticed in a field of Barberkarst Bougainvillea one stem that was red and beautiful burgundy, unlike anything that he had seen before. He took a cutting of it, we grew it out, we evaluated it. We continued to take cuttings until we were able to go from that one little plant to finally last year when we were able to introduce it. So I think that's a really special way of bringing new plants to market. But we also find plants from breeders. So we work with top breeders from around the world. We trial hundreds of plants, oftentimes at the same time as the breeder, to determine what works, what doesn't work. Siren Song is an example of a plant that came to us from a breeder partner. That's a Hukra variety from Terra Nova. And then we also work with several university breeding programs. So Emerald Colonnade, that's another great plant brought to us by the University of Georgia. A lot of great breeding comes out of universities' horticultural programs.
Excellent. So next question, natives were a very popular topic for the questions that we received. Specifically, are native plants created by breeders as good for pollinators as natives?
Yeah, so, it totally depends on the plant. It's not as simple as a yes or no question. It totally depends on what the plants were bred for. So if you think about what pollinators are looking for, they're looking for lots of pollen and lots of nectar. So if a bred variety keeps the general characteristics that made the native or the original form of that plant really particularly interesting to pollinators, then it's likely that that bred variety is going to be just as good for pollinators as the original form. So echinaceas are a great example of this. Echinaceas are fantastic pollinator plants. What we talk about as the cone is actually a disc floret. So it's filled with lots of nectar and lots of pollen in that cone. So if a new echinacea is selected for larger flowers, maybe more abundant flowering, and let's say a shorter habit, because we don't like it when they flop over in the garden, chances are, because you've kept that characteristic relatively unchanged, it's going to be a great pollinator plant, no matter if it's bred or native. But conversely, so let's say stick with the echinaceas. If a breeder is selecting for double flowers, it might be that the double flowers make it harder for pollinators to get into those disc florets. So you might choose to plant that double echinacea for ornamental purposes because you really like the look of it. And you may choose to plant other plants in your garden for your pollinator plants. So it really depends. It's on a case-by-case basis. Each plant has its own role, and it's important to evaluate whatever it is that you are looking for, whatever your goal is for that plant. But both bred varieties and natives can have a place in a role in your garden. Natives particularly can be a great tool, especially when we think about some of the local, highly specialized beneficial insects in your area. But we are by no means purists, and we wouldn't rule out bred varieties for your pollinator gardens just because they're not native.
Great examples and information. In the presentation, Katie, you had talked about going beyond natives. Can you talk more about what you mean there?
Yes, in the trend where we were talking about climate adaptive, I mentioned that. I said, I think we need to start thinking beyond natives. And as Georgia said, it's, we love natives, but we're not purists. And I think that we really all need to be thinking about plants that can adapt to our changing climate. Many native plants might be stressed as conditions change. And we definitely have seen that in the Northwest, for example, this past year, with a lot of heat and drought. And so, some natives can adapt certainly to climate change, but others that are stressed may mean that we need to make other choices and look for plants from the climate similar to the one that we're changing into. In the South with very wet conditions, for instance, that may mean that we look for more plants coming from tropical Asia. It might mean in the Northwest that we're looking at more Mediterranean climate introductions. So I think it's really about thinking more broadly than natives and not thinking that native necessarily always means better.
Great examples. So we also had a few questions on invasive plants. Can you comment on these?
Right, yeah. So, invasives are something that we're always thinking about in the horticultural world. We work closely at Monrovia with the USDA and abide by all the invasive laws and guidelines that they put out. That's both federal and state guidelines. So there are many, many systems in place that help guide us on the issue of invasive plants, especially as we're introducing more plants from different climates that may start working in our regions a little bit better than they used to. Another way that we combat invasive species is, we definitely don't ship invasive plants to parts of the country where they are invasive. For example, we don't sell barberry to certain parts of the East Coast because we know it's invasive there, or butterfly bush to the Pacific Northwest, just as a few examples. There are also universities and breeders that we're working with proactively on this issue, and they are developing sterile varieties of garden plants that have become invasive. So, sterile barberry, sterile butterfly bush, for an example, as I had mentioned before. And they're using the same breeding techniques that you would see when you go to the grocery store and you buy your seedless watermelons or your seedless oranges. So that's pretty exciting on a new plant front. But I also think that we should briefly talk about what an invasive plant is and isn't. So an invasive plant is technically a plant that has spread into an ecosystem, has developed self-sustaining populations, and causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental damage. Now that makes invasive plants much different than plants that are maybe just annoying or aggressive in your garden. So I think of mint, for example. If you're planting mint in your garden, we all know it's a super aggressive spreader and it can be pretty annoying. But it's most likely to spread within your immediate garden environment, whereas an invasive plant would spread down the street, around the corner, and into the ecosystem environment. So it's a totally different animal with invasive plants, and it's something that we take very seriously.
I think that's a great sort of visual picture of invasive versus annoying. And when I think about invasive plants, many of them sort of got their foothold through public works projects or places where we needed a fast growing plant for erosion control or some other purpose. And then, it got out of control in the ecosystem. I do think too, that all of the trends that we talked about certainly can be implemented without use of invasive plants. It's really not that you have to, to follow this trend, there's a particular plant you need to use. For every trend we spoke about, there's a regional option, in every case. And so you don't need to fear that by following the trend, you're going to be doing something harmful.
That makes perfect sense. And great information, and like you said, a great visual look at invasive versus just annoying. So we also had several questions asking when the plants that you talked about in the webinar will be on the market. And we had someone specifically ask about summer lasting coconut.
Right, so summer lasting coconut will be available spring of next year. We had our first sales this year. We're building numbers, it's brand new, but spring of next year, you should see some hit the market.
Great. Now we have what I'm calling the speed round. We have quite a few specific questions on the plants that you talked about in the presentation. So Georgia, I'm just going to fire these questions at you. Ready?
Yes.
Do you have to plant more than one of the Chicago figs to have fruit?
No, they're self-fertile.
Is Dark Night Heuchera a Velosa hybrid?
It is. And actually, when you see heucheras that are purple, red, black, they're all going to be Velosa hybrids because that is the species where that gene comes from.
Excellent. What are the zone recommendations for sweet and solo kiwi?
7 through 9.
What is the Latin name of jade waves?
It is Chamaecyparis obtusa, and the cultivar name, relatively obscure, but it's Monure.
Excellent. How big does Dark Star 9 bark get?
That will get about 5 feet tall by 4 feet wide.
Excellent. Does Luxus compact Japanese holly resist leaf spot?
So we have not seen leaf spot on this variety at our nurseries, but I have not heard Luxus being any more or less resistant to it. Leaf spot can be particularly hard to manage with such wet weather that certain parts of the country have been going through this year. But typically it's mainly aesthetic and not fatal, which is always good news to the gardener.
Excellent. So I know we had a follow-up question to that was how do you treat leaf spot on hollies without using toxic chemicals?
Right. So prevention is really best for all fungal diseases like this. Like I mentioned, super hard when you get really wet springs to control it. But the key is, trying to water at the base. So making sure your leaves aren't sitting in water all day. Hard with wet springs, totally get it. And then try to keep good air circulation. So pruning out so that things aren't quite so dense. And then getting rid of any infected leaves as you see them, and being sure to rake up any debris from around the plant as it falls.
Great tips. So how tall and wide is Evercolor Everest variegated sedge, and what are the zone recommendations?
So Everest is zones 5 through 9, and it'll be about 1.5 feet tall by 2 feet wide or so.
Excellent. We had someone mention Feather Falls. Can you tell us about that one as well?
Yeah, so same zone requirements, same height and width, so really similar. I put them together here on the slideshow so that you can see them side by side. Both really great plants and give that textured, strappy look to the garden. But you can see that they do have sort of a different look. So in my opinion, the Feather Falls lends more of a finer, almost icy look to the garden. So it reads more wispy and silver in the landscape. So whatever look you prefer of the two, they're going to have the same requirements. Just choose whatever one you like the look of.
Great. We had a lot of people that were unfamiliar with potentilla, and we talked about ginger snap potentilla as being a great plant for the East Coast, which brought up a specific question from a viewer who wanted to know, does it tolerate alkaline soil?
Yeah, so potentilla should handle alkaline soil just fine.
Great. So great job on the speed round. Now we're gonna
that was an incredible quiz.
It was quick for sure. Lots of great questions though. I loved that. So we're going to tackle some of the more general topic questions. And so the first one is, do you recommend composting in the spring or the fall?
Well, this question could have two different meanings. If the question is about whether you should be creating compost at what time of year, I know in the West, for me, the answer is all year round. We can be adding to our compost pile, and we should. But if the question is whether or not you should add compost in the spring or fall, I think that both are perfectly good times to add compost, because both seasons are for planting. And that's when you want to, amend your soil, make it, more nutritious for the plants that you're adding. And certainly right now in fall, as we're adding shrubs and trees to our landscape, adding some compost and really making that soil rich is going to get those plants off to the best start.
Yeah, Katie, I totally agree that spring or fall are the best, but if it comes to the time and it's summer and you think, oh crap, I forgot my compost, don't worry, you can still add it.
Absolutely.
As long as your ground isn't frozen, you should be okay.
Right.
Great tips. So we had lots of comments about hydrangeas being a favorite plant. What's new from Monrovia?
Yeah, so if you're a hydrangea lover, our Seaside Serenade collection is quite the fantastic collection. This right here that's up on the slide is Newport. It's our latest addition to the Seaside Serenade series. First thing you notice is this amazing purple flower color. It's purple in acidic soils or amended soils, or this beautiful deep pink otherwise. What makes this plant really unique also is that it's a tetraploid, and that makes it naturally more compact and super sturdy, so it won't split or fall over in the garden. It also has this amazingly thick foliage and flower. Because the foliage is so thick and leathery, it holds up better in the garden. That means it's less likely to wilt during a heat wave and less likely to tatter during strong winds, as some can often do. And because the flower is a lot thicker and waxier, it lasts for an amazing amount of time. So each flower can last up to 2 to 3 months on the plant, and 2 to 3 times longer as a cut stem than a typical garden hydrangea. These do also repeat bloom, so they bloom on both old and new wood, so you get a huge, amazing flower display all throughout the season. This is not the only one in the collection. There are many, many more to choose from, lots of different flower colors and forms, so you can sure to find one that fits your style within this whole selection here.
Great. Our attendees also wanted to hear some additional suggestions for indoor statement plants.
Yeah, so there are lots of choices when it comes to indoor plants. We will have many species of ficus available. So I had mentioned Ficus elastica tenicki on the webinar, but down below here you see all the different types of ficus that we'll have. From the classic fiddle leaf fig to more of the unique ones like this tresor, which has more narrow, long leaves and this beautiful bronze overcast to the foliage. But we also have vines. So Monstera ginny up here in the top left, that's a great one to grow in the house. It's really easy, can make a huge statement, especially when you let it vine upwards. So really interesting way of using statement plants in a smaller space by vining up. I also really love this Peperomia raindrop. So there are many, many peperomias out there. Most of them are pretty small, but raindrop has leaves that are really dark green, glossy, and they are quite large. And it's overall a fairly large plant too. So that makes it a really unique peperomia and one that I think is a really cool statement piece in my home.
I love how many of our houseplants really are examples of some of the trends like dressed up bohemian, where you are looking for these really graphic patterns in leaves, like the Stramanthe triostar and some of the different, ficus, the philodendron, certainly. And I think the other trend that we spoke about where these really come into play is that, sort of sense of relaxation and kind of upscaling a bit. And the fact that we are growing in some cases, several plants in one pot so that you get that instant satisfaction of a larger plant right away in either your outdoor space or your, indoors. So I feel like the versatility of these plants across several trends makes them just so interesting and valuable, really.
And living in the North, I'm so excited about these new houseplants and some new uses for them because it extends my ability to garden and to feel like I'm gardening. So I'm excited about that. So the next question, we had many people asking for additional information on several gardening topics, including drought tolerant selections, regional plant choices, and pests such as rabbits and deer. And one of the specific question was, how can we find more information on drought tolerant plants?
So several ways. One is, as you mentioned, Kathleen, if you're an email subscriber to the Monrovia newsletter, we often actually provide great drought tolerant plant tips through the planting season, spring, summer, into fall, because we regionalize our newsletter. We also produced a great guide called Low Water, High Beauty that we released early this summer, and that's still available on our website. But on an ongoing basis, what I would recommend is checking out My Plant Finder. So you simply come to the Monrovia homepage, click on My Plant Finder, and you get this drop-down menu where you enter your zip code and get your climate zone if you don't know it. And then you can look up plants by, obviously plant type, whether it's a shrub, tree, perennial. Down here, where it's under water needs, you can click on that and click low or minimal and get a list of drought tolerant plants that are perfect for your area.
Great tool for planning and just great inspiration too. So our next question was, what about areas that are receiving too much water, and what plants would you recommend?
Yeah, so Katie talked about My Plant Finder, another great spot not only to find drought tolerant plants, but also under that landscape use, there's a great very wet area landscape use that you can check to find lots of inspiration. But I'll highlight a few options. So here I've highlighted astilbe, which are great plants that in areas that receive a lot of moisture. This particular selection is called Visions Volcano, and it's a fantastic variety. It has this really large, deep pink flower that I just love. And I also really like that it's later flowering. So it extends the season more into the summertime, which is pretty nice. It's a great plant in wet areas. And then moving on here is honeymoon rose hibiscus, or hibiscus machudos, and sometimes called swamp rose. And that name should clue you into the fact that this plant is a great choice for your soggy soils. I love these hardy hibiscus because they are cold hardy plants. Despite looking like they are straight out of the tropics, they have that gorgeous, large tropical flower in gorgeous colors. This one here is rose, this beautiful deep pink that gets deeper, closer to the eye. The honeymoon series is a great size as well, so 3 feet tall by 3 feet wide. And then lastly is a variety of dogwood. So this is creme de mint, which is a little more compact than typical, so 4 to 5 feet tall and wide. It has this gorgeous variegated foliage, so creams and minty greens throughout the spring and summer. And then in the fall, it gets this gorgeous reddish pink tinge. And then when the leaves drop, of course, you get that fabulous dogwood stem. So these are beautiful, bright yellow all throughout the winter. So 4 seasons of interest, and dogwoods are absolutely fantastic for your extremely wet soils.
Those are beautiful selections. Thanks for that. So what about pests? Specifically, people were asking about deer and rabbits.
So deer and rabbits are, they're very adaptive. Their palate is always changing. They're just when you think that you found the perfect deer resistant plant, oh, they've discovered that they like it. I think one of the important things to note is that labeling a plant deer resistant is really a very localized regional expertise kind of idea, because deer can eat different things in different areas, same as rabbits. So that's why we have our garden center customers choose to put a deer resistant tag that they think is appropriate on our labels. So one tip I would say is, if a plant, if your garden center believes that it is deer resistant, look for that tag on the plant. That's going to be a great indication, because it is such a local concept, really. I think that having something on our website or, in another source that says, no matter what, deer won't, eat this, that's just not really accurate.
Yeah, deer and rabbit are not too picky, that's for sure. But there are a couple. So say you've gone to the garden center and you picked your plants out, but then you want to buy another plant, and maybe you don't have a resource around to tell you if it's going to be deer or rabbit resistant. And there are a couple of general characteristics that tend to be less appealing to rabbits and deer, though not foolproof by any means. But any plant that has fuzzy, leathery, spiky, prickly leaves, stems, something like that, less tasty. Anything that has strong smells, so think mint or lavender, or even stems that are really sappy, those tend to not be as heavily trafficked for those deer in your garden. But again, good general guide, but not perfect. Your local garden center is going to be your best bet.
Great tips and suggestions for those garden nemesists. So we had some requests for more regional plant information and how people can learn more about plants that work specifically in their region. And I know we touched on that a little bit more, but can you guys elaborate a little bit?
Sure. Just again, going back to Plant Finder, one of the ways that you can make sure that you're looking at plants that are suitable for your region is to enter your zip code on our site, and then that'll show your climate zone, and that'll be the reference as you search for other plants. The system knows where you are, and so it'll be showing you plants that are appropriate. But sometimes you may enter in the search bar up at the top of the homepage, a plant that you read about or hear about. You may not go to Plant Finder. And in that case, I think that, if you've got your climate zone listed, you might see this message on something like Jazzy Jewel Gold Hibiscus. If you are not in zones 9 through 11, this message may pop up. If it is appropriate for your zone, you will see good to grow. And then that you're choosing a plant that should be perfectly suited to where you are.
Excellent. Well, that covers all of our questions. Thank you, Katie and Georgia, for all the great inspiration and plant information and tips and just great info for all of our viewers today. So thanks to everyone for joining us, and look for more webinar topics coming soon.
Thanks, Kathleen. This was a lot of fun. Look forward to it.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thanks, guys.